Hi, Misha here, and we looked at the Mercury program and then the Gemini program, and in those videos I promised we would look at Apollo, and I thought it would end up being a two-parter. Well, it's going to be a three-parter, and there will even be a bit of an addendum, which could even be considered a fourth part, but we'll get to that when we get to it. I just couldn't think of a way to do this appropriately without, breaking it up. In part one, we're going to look at the Saturn launch system, specifically the Saturn V, but also I want to give acknowledgement to the Saturn I and Saturn Ib because they're often overlooked, and yet they actually flew some very important missions. Apollo 7, for example, as well as Skylab. Well, Skylab 2, 3, and 4, not Skylab 1. Yeah, just talking about that, the similarities, the differences. And then in part 2, we'll talk about the command service module, as well as the capsule itself, details about that. And then in part 3, we'll really focus in on the lunar roving, the difference in H and J missions, maybe talk about some canceled stuff, so on and so forth. But yeah, for this one, we're going to look at the rocket and basically the overall journey from the Earth to the Moon and back. And I have a few set up here, different sizes of Saturn V. The biggest one is a 1/200 scale. This is a mahogany. Then we have the little one from that Space Voyager set. Yeah, it's neat for the 5 inches. We have a Saturn 1B. It's not a very high quality diecast. It is diecast, but it's the only one I could find. So we'll use it as an example piece. And then we have a larger one from the Space Voyager series, which I'm not sure, maybe 1/400 scale. Anyway, it kind of reminds me of the Dragon, and it has a couple of neat features in and of itself. So yeah, that's what we'll get to, guys. I said in the Gemini video, Apollo actually began before Gemini. So let's go all the way back to 1960. Whew, where to begin? Well, Saturn V. Well, the 5 actually comes from the 5 F1 engines on the first stage, the primary stage. However, it was actually the third major development in the series. Here are mine here, increasingly small, and this actually is not my smallest Saturn V. It was given to me. He's tiny. It's, I don't think, 2 inches. Kind of fun though. Anyway, Saturn I. First written with the numeral 1, later changed to I when they kind of went to the Roman styling. Actually, it goes back to the 1950s. Remember I said in Gemini that Apollo in a lot of ways predated it. Back then, NASA didn't exist, but there was a requirement to get a satellite up to 20,000 pounds into low Earth orbit. And at that time, various agencies, namely the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, were competing. They had their own rocket programs. And in 1957, under Wernher von Braun, this project would begin, under nominally the auspices of the Air Force. Work would start, but in 1958, NASA would be established, and by the end of that year, they would kind of draw all this in, all these programs. They would sit around and examine what was going to be their new heavy lift rocket. At this time, U.S. rockets could not even get 4,000 pound payload into orbit. So 20,000 pounds, 5 times greater, nearly 6 times greater than what they could do. Quite impressive. In January of 1959, the Saturn was selected. And actually the name Saturn already was in use by 1958, even before NASA came in, so it goes back a long ways. There were some earlier names tried out, but Saturn was an early favorite, and it frankly stuck. So the Saturn I was picked in 1959, and work would progress. Even though it was nearly canceled once, by 1961 it was a favorite. In fact, President Kennedy, after making his speech about going to the moon in May, pointed to the Saturn program as one of the most promising projects in the U.S., and, as it turns out correctly, felt that this would be where America would surpass the Soviet Union. Because at this time, 1961, and for the next couple of years, frankly, they were kicking our ass. Now this toy here, it is die-cast, is of the Saturn I-B. Actually, I believe it's supposed to be the emergency version that could have been used for Skylab. Either way, it's the only 1B I've got for now. These are all 5s. So, the 1 versus the 1B. The 1 was designed to carry up to 20,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. It was about 180 feet tall and had a diameter of less than 22 feet. And it would have at least 2 stages, including what would ultimately be the S4 stage. The first test flight was October 1961, and at that time, this was the most fuel that was ever on the pad, and at that time, rockets also had a habit of exploding. People were worried. Luckily, the Saturn was one of the very first, frankly, functional rockets. In fact, it had 10 launches, no failures. It used 8 H1 engines. Earlier, different engines were trialed out, but eventually the H1 was set on. It had 8 fins, and it had tanks. Now, interestingly, this was based on Jupiter and Redstone technology. These weren't repurposed Jupiter and Redstone structures, but they were built using the same tooling and technology, just extended out. So you would have that as a primary stage, and then have a secondary stage with heavy lift capabilities. So after the first successful test flight, there would be a few more, but the next milestone would come January of 1964, when the 5th launch, the first one was named SA-1, this would be SA-5, would be the first to launch an active S4 secondary stage. The primary would get it near Earth orbit, and then the secondary stage would ignite its motors and go into orbit. So much so that it would actually not deteriorate until 2 years later. So the 5th test flight would be the first to get a stage into orbit. Not bad. However, that's where the 1B comes along. By 1964, this is under development. Also, by this time, they have a better idea of what the Apollo capsule will be, and 20,000 pounds just isn't going to cut it. So the original one was pretty short-lived. It was eventually just straight up canceled, but not until 10 flights. The final 3 flights actually launched boilerplate Apollo command modules, fake facsimiles, along with micro Pegasus satellites. And the final one would be July 30th, 1965. So that's the Saturn I. What about the 1B, though? It actually had a career that lasted longer than the 5. The 1B was an uprated 1, so we still had 8 engines in a cluster, 8 fins, we had tanks. Depending on the payload, 140 to 180 feet tall, so about half the height at most of a Saturn V. But what was important about the B, it had much heavier lift capability. At the beginning, it could do up to 32,000 pounds, but towards the end, as they perfected it, this was pushed all the way up to 46,000 pounds. Now we're just talking to low Earth orbit. To the moon, it really couldn't get much of anything anywhere, 4,000 pounds or so. It was 2 stages. We had the uprated lower, we had the S4B upper, which would later be used on the 5. That was actually good because it provided a common interface for the Apollo CSM. But anywho, like I said, it was already under development in 1964. Actually, it goes all the way back to 62 at the beginning. And the first test flight was February 1966. And they would be used initially to test the Block 1 Apollo CSM that was uncrewed. The first crewed test was to be Apollo 1. Well, what was retroactively called Apollo 1. In the beginning, the structure for missions was either SA or AS, depending on if the Saturn or Apollo was the prime test subject, and then, for example, SA-201. And I believe Apollo 1's original name was SA-204. But, of course, January of 1967, during a dress rehearsal, there was a tragic fire. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Apollo module itself. The mission was supposed to launch in February of 67. Obviously, everything got delayed, and the whole program was re-examined. But that wasn't the Saturn 1B's fault. In fact, out of its 9 launches, it had no serious failures. It was used to test other elements of Apollo, including on Apollo 5 with the LM. It was also the launch vehicle for Apollo 7, October 1968, which was the first crewed Block 2 CSM. But of course, it wasn't really powerful enough to get anything to the moon. But it would return to use for things like Skylab, not the lab itself, but the crewed missions up there, and its last flight would be July 1975 for the Apollo-Soyuz test project. So, between early 66 and mid-75, it flew 9 times successfully, even though the kind of cluster system gave it the nickname of Cluster's Last Stand, something shared by the original one. It has a unique look, with fins and all that, but from the get-go, this was a test vehicle for Apollo. This was really getting to Saturn V, because they knew it wouldn't be enough. Originally, they thought 20,000 pounds would be enough to get to the moon, but as weight increased, 30, even 40,000 was not going to be enough. What was originally classed as a heavy lift vehicle would kind of slide down to being a medium, or if you want to call it, basically 1 was reclassed as a medium, the 1B became heavy, and the 5 became a super heavy lift vehicle, and a true 3-stager plus all the CSM stuff. So let's dive into the 5. The Saturn V is quite possibly one of the most advanced and awe-inspiring machines ever built by man, and no one company could ever do it. The prime contractors, you had Boeing for the S1C primary stage. You had North American for the S2 secondary. And you had Douglas for the S4B third stage. You also had IBM, which made kind of the top of that stage. That's not even getting into the command module. Now, with the Saturn I and Saturn IB, Chrysler made the first stage, but Douglas still made the S4B. The F1 engine that it used was powered by Pt.1 fuel, and it was selected early on. Very impressive engine system. The second stage would actually use the J2 engine, again 5 of them, and this would be liquid hydrogen, and this would be the same as had been used on the one. But like I said, the one, you actually use the H1 engines. And of course, this thing would split up. Now, these mahogany models are nice. It's a 1/200 scale, but they're fixed. They don't separate, and detail, paint-wise, is good, but pretty minimal. The bells here have some detailing. We've got the fins. Fun fact, they later figured out these fins were actually not useful. They were hoped for guidance and stability, which they gave nominal help, but the added weight wasn't worth it, so if they'd continued on, they probably would have removed them. And we have the command module here with the tower escape system. After Gemini, where they experimented with ejection seats, they went back to this. Overall length for the whole structure is over 363 feet tall. And for the first and second stages, we're over 33 feet wide. It tapers down towards the top, of course. So, the whole structure here, we do break apart. This little model is fine, or toy, but it's very fixed. This one is also from Space Voyagers, bigger though, and it actually separates. Although for some reason it only has 4 engines instead of 5 on the bottom. So it launches. Actually, the center engine, which isn't on here, is the first to fire about 9 seconds before it actually lifts off. Then the other ones, which can gimbal, ignite. And it pushes up. Now, this first stage burns for less than 3 minutes. Actually, only about 168, 170 seconds. It's mostly to get altitude, not speed. It gets over 40 miles high, and then we'll disconnect, separate. The ring will fall off here. The ring is fixed to the bottom, but typically it would disconnect, pushing itself off, letting the second stage go with its 5. Again, this only shows 4, but it's small. What do you expect? J2 engines. In about half a minute after these two separate, so it will go and ignite these engines. So about 210 seconds into the flight. And its job is to get it up and through the upper atmosphere. That's the job here. And then finally, of course, we get to the third stage, separation. Interestingly, the ring here actually stays with the second stage. And notice this does have only 1 engine, which is actually correct. But this is relatively small. It's a good size in the hand. And this one, while bigger, doesn't give much detail. So with that, I ended up turning to a toy. Meet the Space Voyagers Saturn V here. Notice it is a little bigger than the mahogany. Like I said, this is 200 scale. This is 144 scale. So it's roughly 3 feet long. It's a plastic model, primarily. A little bit of metal in the base and some rubber for things like the fins. Hard rubber. It's not a bad thing. I think the engines are too. It does have 5. My middle one's a little warpy. But I considered getting the Dragon 172 scale. But it too is a plastic model. Much better detailing. It's also $400. Yeah. This was like 40 or 50. So, yeah. We're going to use this to illustrate kind of the staging because it does have quite a few little fun features. Why not? Again, like my mahogany model, but it is just kind of static, kind of there. And the little one, it's nice, but just doesn't quite show everything. So, let's get into the procedure. So we're over 40 miles high. Not moving all that fast. The center engine, which is the only one that can't move or gimbal, started first, it actually shuts off a little less than half a minute before the others. This was to keep acceleration at or around 4G. You go past that, not only is it uncomfortable for the crew, you have issues. Like I said, the whole structure more or less burns for 168 seconds. Of course, it can be adjusted. The whole thing at this point is actually being controlled way up here in the third stage by the IBM instrument system, the computer system. It does telemetry, it adjusts as needed, all kinds of variables. But then we separate the 1C from the 2 stage. So stage 1 separates and falls off, and stage 2 ignites up. Now in the beginning, the interstage ring actually stays connected to stage 2. Quite a bit is done to ensure that when it falls away a few seconds later, it doesn't hit the engine bells. One flaw with this model toy is the second stage ring stays attached, but it's kind of a constraint of how it's made so they can be put together. Interestingly, this one makes the opposite mistake. The stages are the other direction. Oh well. It happens. Well, wait, I'm trying to find out where I put it. There we go. Sorry, guys. You see the interstage ring is on the first stage. That's not really correct either, but it does show you how the engines get exposed. And this one does have all correct 5 ones in here, which is nice. The outer ones can gimbal. The inner one, again, these are J2s, are fixed. This is not feeding from Pt.1. It's liquid hydrogen. And this is really when we start gaining some good speed, and we're going through the upper atmosphere. And stage 2 continues on for longer. It'll burn for roughly 6 minutes. And it nearly gets us all the way there. We're at over 15,600 miles per hour, and we reach an altitude of over 100,000, excuse me, that'd be impressive, 100 miles up. Exactly how far kind of depends on the mission and the payload profile. Early ones like Apollo 11, they got it pretty far up there, 108, 109 miles. So we're pretty much doing the heavy lifting here with this section manufactured by North American. Pretty interesting. Then we get to the S4B. Oh, almost forgot. First, though, this comes off. The escape system, along with the outer casing, falls away. Actually, not long after the interstage ring, because at this point it's too high to be important or effective anyway. So it goes away. Then we get to this system here. And then once we get over 100,000, I keep saying that, I apologize, 100 miles, we separate the second from the third stages. So this is jettisoned after doing quite a bit of heavy lifting and leaving our stage that's actually been in development for a number of years. And it doesn't have a lot to do at this point. This is a single J2. And it goes ahead and gets it all the way up to a parking orbit. About 118 miles for the G&H missions, but under 108 for the J missions. We'll talk about mission profiles later. And it only burns at this point about 2.5 minutes. And gets us to escape velocity, or at least, I shouldn't say escape, orbital velocity of about 17,600 miles. So it does pump us up, but you'd think for this big of a stage, it's not really doing much work. And to be fair, yeah, the second stage here isn't. But a critical thing, the original S4 stage was not reignitable. This is. The engine can be turned on and off. In a standard mission profile, this would happen twice. So we get into orbit a parking orbit, as it's called, and people are starting to breathe a little easy. And the system stays connected up like this for about 1.5 orbits. So about 2 hours, 15, 20 minutes. But then they prepare to reignite this engine. It will burn for 6 minutes, and it will allow the craft to escape the Earth's pull and get in a lunar trajectory, eventually falling into the moon's gravity well. So this is really its big time to shine, is trans-lunar injection, putting the craft on a course. So that's its second burn. Poof. So we get on the way to the moon. But the third stage's job is not quite done yet. Still one more very important thing for it to do before it will to be jettisoned. Roughly 40 minutes after trans-lunar injection, the Apollo CSM will separate from the third stage. This is the high gain antenna. It actually can flip up on this one. I do it single-handed. Maybe. Hang on. It's a little stiff on these. Well, it's kind of a rubbery material, so there we go. It's good. It won't bend or break. It does, in the real world, fold up like that and then deploys. It's worth pointing out that only the moon missions had these. The low Earth orbit ones did not, because it wasn't needed. So, next is the maneuver called transposition, docking, and extraction, primarily performed by the module pilot. So they would flip around 180 degrees because they needed to get some payload out of the third stage before discarding it. So what will happen, the adapter end will open up like so, flower petal, revealing the LM inside. Now originally it was supposed to do just like this, open up like a flower, the panels there. But they found during a test in Apollo 7 that one of the sections did not deploy, meaning that the CSM could not safely approach for risk of impacting. So what they did for later missions, these would disconnect. They would open, and then the springs would push them away in a safe direction. So one complaint about this toy is that these can come off quite easily. I don't know if it was the designer's intent, probably wasn't, but actually that's authentic and you can take them off. Either way, this would come in and dock. And it was a multi-stage process. First there would be soft dock, soft latching, which used a probe and drogue system with 3 latches. Then this would be followed by hard lock with 12 latches. After that was achieved, which typically would take roughly an hour, connections were made between the CSM and the LM, and then 30 to 50 minutes later it would pull it out of the stage, if I can do it here, and have its LM. I should point out that with Apollo 14 things did not go to plan. Now the astronauts are already on the way to the moon, so they're not in any big rush, but Apollo 14 was starting to run out of time because of fuel and all that. They took nearly 2.5 hours, well over 2 hours 15 minutes. It wasn't their fault that there was a problem with the probe and drogue, but eventually it worked. But normally it would be under an hour. So this would afterwards, of course it doesn't do this in real life, but fold it up. This would be jettisoned off in a safe direction, guided by NASA. Sometimes they'd use these to hit the moon. Leaving this structure here, heading on. They would deploy the high gain antenna. They would keep the LM legs folded up for the journey. And while they were connected, they did not need spacesuits. Typically, they would seal it off for safety purposes, and the crew would remain in the capsule. And they're on their way. And that's where we're going to end today's little fun story. Here are the stages laid out. The first stage, is obviously the largest. We're at about 138 feet, 33 feet wide. The secondary is also 33 feet wide, at least until you get to the end. And it's not quite 82 feet. And then our third stage, it tapers down to under 22 feet and is slightly less than 62 feet long. This was and is the heaviest lift rocket America's ever made, and it's the only one to send astronauts beyond Earth orbit into more or less deep space. It was very impressive. It could carry over 300,000 pounds to low Earth orbit, or nearly 96,000 pounds to the moon. Well, sort of. It would put 96,000 pounds into a trans-lunar ejection, which counted this stage. So you had to kind of ding off for that. In reality, of course, it was much less. But still, considering we started off with 20,000 pounds with the Saturn I, you gotta give credit. This whole thing, this rocket system was announced in the earlier part of 1962. Of course, it was far from produced yet. And at that time, NASA wasn't sure how they were going to make the moon mission happen. The three main things were direct descent, just send a craft to the moon, it's going to land on it, which actually influenced the Apollo CSM, we'll talk about in part 2. Another one was low Earth orbit rendezvous, so sending up multiple craft and docking and making a system and going to the moon that way. But what they ultimately settled on in 1963 was lunar orbit rendezvous, which is getting us to the CSM LM combo wherever I laid it. There we go. But they chose. And so, yeah, where it began. The Saturn V first flew as a test full up with Apollo 4. And it would fly again with Apollo 6 unmanned. There was a third unmanned flight scheduled, but since things were going so well, it was canceled. Instead, we go to Apollo 7, which was the first crewed flight with the Block 2 CSM in October 1968. Now, that, like I said, was with the 1B. The full going to the moon 5 would be December of 1968 with Apollo 8, which, funnily enough, was an unplanned mission, sort of. But we'll get into profiles next time. Again, there's so much here, guys, and I am a total novice and moron about this. I'm the furthest thing from a rocket scientist, but I do find it very, very interesting. And these are pretty fun little toys for the money. They certainly illustrate, with only a few little flaws, how the whole process worked. And sometimes seeing is believing and kind of understanding just how much went on here. In some ways it was dirt simple. In some ways it was very complicated. They tried to minimize moving parts. This was mostly made out of aluminum, but it did use some titanium where necessary. The fuel systems were minimized as much as possible with tanks and stuff. A lot of asbestos and even quark used for various purposes. Because, weight matters so very much when it comes to getting things into orbit. I mentioned that it does have quite a good low Earth orbit lifting ability. It was actually very useful in 1973 with Skylab, which was technically the Saturn V's final flight in May of that year. They would build 15 of these. 13 would actually be launched, and there would be no true failures. Apollo 6, which was an unmanned test, was the only partial failure because 3 out of the 5 F1 engines shut off early, but the computer, way up here in this section, was able to compensate and burn the remaining 2 long enough to get it into an orbit. It wasn't quite what they wanted, but it was there. So even that really cannot be considered a failure. It certainly didn't explode. So the Saturn I, 1B, and 5 have a very good safety record. There was another partial glitch with the center engine with Apollo 13, but there and again the computer was able to compensate, and it made orbit. And for the day and time, the computer here and the computer in the CSM, even the one in the LM, very advanced. We laugh today, but they really were, and they were very, very necessary, as well as communications and the work of thousands, tens of thousands. It wasn't just getting 3 men to the moon. That was just the tip of the spear, as it were, but so much work went into every stage of these. Pun intended. But yeah, next time we'll talk about the crewed part of the vehicle, what's in the capsule, the service module, and getting to the moon. Hope you're enjoying this. It was a lot more work than I anticipated, but I wanted to at least give it a go. So let me know what you think. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.